ways of looking at it, a negative and a positive. So first of all, a negative response that we should have to the Magna Carta, or might be able to have to the Magna Carta, and then in light of that those negative thoughts of mine, some positive thoughts, some kind of hope that we can still get out of Magna Carta. And I'm interested very broadly in kind of everything I do in trying to use legal history, the history of the law, to better use and understand the law today. So that's what I'm talking about Magna Carta as a kind of broader point of. Okay, so you've probably, if you know, today or the past few weeks, seen some very strange and grand claims for Magna Carta. Just one to pick out this morning, I saw on Twitter, people claiming that Magna Carta is the foundation moment for gay rights, which is so nonsensical. It was Peter Tatchell, the gay rights campaigner, was saying Magna Carta is the starting point for gay rights. And I'd encourage you, if you hear anyone say things like that, to ask them which chapter of Magna Carta they're specifically referring to. Be a good lawyer. Ask them to cite something and explain where it comes from. But there's a few other things. The document we're celebrating today isn't called Magna Carta. It wasn't the Magna Carta that was signed in 1215. It only becomes the Magna Carta in 1217 when it's paired up with the Forest Charter, the small charter. You can't have a big charter without a small charter. That's all it is the big charter that goes with the small charter. The document signed in 1215 was not called the Magna Carta. The document signed on this day in 1215, depending on disputes about calendars, was not the document that is held in the British Library, the 4 copies. That was worked out later and it was filled out. So again, there's something odd to be interrogated about making this a day, making this Magna Carta Day. It wasn't a piece of legislation. The concept of legislation didn't really exist then. Legislation, as we know it, starts, most proper legal historians, rather than kind of strange legal historians like me, would say that legislation starts right near the end of the 13th century. What it was a charter, a coronation charter. This was a normal thing for new monarchs to issue a coronation charter, a set of promises of what they were going to do in their rule. It was unusual in that it was extracted during warfare. I'm going to come back to that, but it's just a charter, like so many charters. You can put it next to previous coronation charters and see a lot of similarity in the way that it's structured. Okay? It was repealed, like Ian said, never really came into force, but it was decisively got rid of in a matter of weeks. In early August, the Pope said, you don't have to follow this, and it was gone. It didn't bring peace. The baronial war, the civil war that was going on, kept going, both sides of Magna Carta. It didn't stop it. King John died during the war. It doesn't have any legal force. You can't rely on anything in Magna Carta. Appeals get made to it, and I'm going to come back to why we might appeal to Magna Carta. But it doesn't do anything. It guarantees freedom of the church, it guarantees freedom of the City of London, and even the nice words about trial by peers. Again, Ian sort of covered this. It just means this group of about 150 of the biggest landowners had their own court, and the king couldn't introduce his arbitrary justice. This is a specific contextual complaint about the king imposing himself on baronial disputes and demanding to be paid for the privilege of having the king's justice. Okay? That's just to exclude the king and to say that the barons should be able to judge their own disputes. That is a very different thing to what we would think of as the rule of law and threat, Rio, and a trial, and things like that. You can, if you want an intelligent thing to say, claim the jury trial starts in 1215, but it doesn't start with Magna Carta. In 1215, the Church in England withdrew the authority for ministers of the Church to judge ordeals. That's where jury trial starts from. Once you can't get the Church to authorise your trial by ordeal, your trial by ordeal begins to fade. It begins to lose its legitimacy. Jury trial begins to take its place. It's a slow and lengthy process, but in 1215 the ordeal was still the main way of telling whether someone was guilty or innocent. Okay? It disappears from historical record within about 200 years. The last major Middle-Age use of Magna Carta is in the Peasants' Revolt in the middle of the 14th century. After that, it pretty much disappears from the record until we get to the English Civil War, and a jurist called Edward Coke, spelled Coke. He writes about Magna Carta as being this principle of minimal powers of kings, of the king being limited by the law in the context of the English Civil War. Okay, that's the return of Magna Carta, the invention of the myth of Magna Carta. That's That's when Magna Carta takes off. It then gets used in the English Civil War. Yes, it's used by Coke. It's also used by the Levellers. They refer to Magna Carta. It's used by Parliament. It gets taken up in the American War for Independence and in the American Declaration of Independence. Tom Paine famously calls for a Magna Carta of the colonies. It's used in the anti-slavery movement. It was used by the suffragettes. It was even used by the Occupy movement. Okay, so that's something. That's not nothing. So all that kind of, it's not this, it's not that. Those are historical facts, but it does mean something. Just because something is a myth or a metaphor or a symbol doesn't mean it doesn't have some sort of force. So it's had this force. What is that force? Okay, so this is the positive. I've done the negative, this is the positive. Whilst Magna Carta itself, or whilst the thing signed in 1215, might not be a progressive document, might not have any legal force, essentially doesn't mean anything. It can be useful for something, okay? Looking at it from a more positive perspective, trying to find something useful. It's a peace treaty, as I said. A failed peace treaty, but it's a peace treaty. It's a peace treaty in a war, okay? And this war is, like most wars, a class war. It was a war between the baronial class and the monarchy. It's a class war. It's a struggle over the different rights and powers and different freedoms that different classes have. When the war actually ends, so it gets reissued by Henry III, or in his name in 1216, it gets reissued again in 1217. The 1217, and this is where I'm going to focus as the start of somewhere where we could use Magna Carta positively, or as a foundation for some kind of progressive political project. 1217, Chapter 7. Chapter 7 of the 1215 document says stuff about how widows must be allowed to have their dowry and be supported. Chapter 7 in 1217 changes the language slightly and says that no widow will be denied their estovers or rights to the commons. Okay? 1217 is when the Forest Charter is written as well, which guarantees certain rights to the commons. This is the only document that has rights for peasants. The Forest Charter allows the peasantry to graze their animals, or let their animals feed in the forests, and it allows for the collecting of wood from the forest. Okay, this idea of the commons and of estovers is, again, taking from forests, from nature, the basic things you need to survive. Again, mostly it would be wood, it would be firewood. Wood being the most important hydrocarbon of the time, much like oil. The gathering of fuel and the feeding of animals. This is provisions in these charters that allow for subsistence, that allow for survival. Now, obviously, none of us want to live in the 13th century. I'm not saying that the 13th century was in any way better than today. But today, none of us are guaranteed subsistence, our basic survival. And those things that try and guarantee our basic survival are being actively attacked from all directions. Okay? So, don't listen to the powers of the day tell you to remember Magna Carta whilst they get rid of the Human Rights Act. But do remember Magna Carta as guaranteeing a traditional indigenous English right to the commons and to basic subsistence. That's what I think we can find in Magna Carta that is good and progressive, and not what we can't find in Magna Carta, which is the reactionary myth that is being celebrated today. Those are my thoughts. Thanks.
First person standing up here that doesn't have a smartphone. Don't read anything. Okay, so I'm going to say a bit more about these kind of myths that are surrounding Magna Carta. Really kind of how it is being used today in terms of political debate and trying to turn it back onto the debate regarding the Human Rights Act and the potential Bill of Rights. So coming up after Ian's talk and Henry's talk, I think it's clear to see that me describing the Magna Carta as undergoing mission creep is probably being incredibly generous towards Magna Carta, but seeing as it is its birthday, we're supposed to be generous towards it, so forgive me for that. So, in terms of the kind of actual text of Magna Carta, and the links between the Magna Carta and the human rights that are being stressed today. So David Cameron today notion that if we were to pass a UK Bill of Rights, we would enshrine the legacy of Magna Carta into UK law. Reference to Magna Carta, as you've heard, have also been used by the signatories to the US Declaration of Independence. It is also mentioned during the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I will get to these in just a little bit, but I want to just say briefly about, in terms of the Magna Carta, in terms of the people that it actually refer to, in terms of the concept of individual rights, the universality of rights. Can we find that in the Magna Carta? And straight away the answer is no. So it is very much a kind of a feudal document, so there is a lot of reference to kind of the divisions that you would find in feudal society. So you had free men specifically are mentioned. You also have mentions of barons, of knights, and of the clergy. So it really is referring to these different concepts in society. You don't see this whole claim to universality that you do get in kind of later human rights treaties. So ultimately, as Henry said, it did ultimately benefit just a very small section of society. But in terms of kind of specific sections of society that we might recognise today, for example, women, what does Magna Carta say about them? Well, firstly, one of the provisions of the original Magna Carta was that it did prevent a widow from having to enter into a subsequent arranged marriage, which I suppose is some kind of progression. However, it also says this with regards to women in the Magna Carta, is that no one shall be arrested or imprisoned upon the appeal of a woman for the death of any other than her husband. So when we see free man in the Magna Carta, when we see the reference to freeman in the Magna Carta, it really is referring to a quite kind of narrow concept of a human being that we do see in subsequent human rights treaties. You also do see kind of references to certain ethnicities. So as Henry mentioned, it's a war treaty, so there's reference to the Welshmen. We've also heard reference to the Jews in it. Then in kind of when you had the transposition of kind of English law over to Ireland, which is arguably one of the kind of proto-colonies that you can see, access to English courts was refused to Irishmen up in late 1270s, early 1300s, when you began to get the courts established. Irishmen were expressly refused access to English courts. Very often, in order to get access to these courts, you would see that people would kind of change their names. So they would anglicise their names from Irish names into English names to try and claim their English lineage and give them access to English courts. It also was, and to kind of emphasise this importance of having kind of an English lineage, it was considered defamatory to actually call an English person Irish. So you can see at the time that when we were drafting kind of documents like this, trying to claim their universality as applying to all human beings, it is certainly kind of stressing it. But I don't want to be too harsh on Magna Carta because it is, of course, a document of its time. And it can evolve, and as we've heard, it can take on this myth position. As Henry said, this myth really gained kind of leverage with the evolution by Cook. And it really was seized upon in the US Declaration of Independence. And the American colonists really did rely upon it when they drafted their famous kind of aspirational idea of a democracy and of human rights. And in the US Constitution, in this kind of Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution, before that, it states this famous statement that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, this immediately raises the question of what we mean by men. Well, obviously, straight away it doesn't mean women, again, but it also doesn't mean all men, which was famously kind of expressed in the famous Supreme Court decision of Dred Scott, which denied access to courts to Native Americans and African Americans, who was the plaintiff in this instance. So again, this idea of rights applying to everybody wasn't seen even in the US Declaration in the 1800s. Really, we don't see it perhaps until after World War II, and we see it in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we did have it in the 20th century, early 20th century, as we heard mentioned before, with it being used by the suffragette movement as a claim to their enfranchisement. It was incredibly important. And then it really was seized upon then in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt in particular. And this time, in the text of the Universal Declaration, we see mention that it applies to all human beings. Language of everybody has these rights. So clearly, if this document is being inspired by Magna Carta, 700 years later we are seeing this kind of progression, this evolution of the kind of principles that are contained therein, which I would like to describe as it undergoing kind of mission creep. Now, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights doesn't have any teeth. Okay, it's a purely aspirational document. It wasn't until subsequent treaties. In terms of the UN context, you have the ICCPR. In terms of Europe, you have the Council of Europe and the European Convention of Human Rights. And again, this is a document that's claiming kind of universality. So if we want to claim the legacy of Magna Carta is influencing all these documents, then we have to say that Magna Carta has clearly undergone mission creep. It has clearly evolved from what it was supposed to be 700 years ago. Obviously has done that. And I just want to stress that at this time, today, we are celebrating Magna Carta precisely because of its mission creep, while at the same time those arguments are being used to criticise and undermine the European Convention of Human Rights by saying it has completely evolved from what it was envisaged, what Winston Churchill envisioned it as being back in 1950. And I would contend in this instance that human rights are supposed to evolve, okay? By definition, they are almost utopian in nature. And utopias are, by definition, unattainable. We're always striving towards them. Human rights can be described as utopian in nature. And of course, we will disagree as to the kind of utopia that we want to achieve. We see this debate within human rights themselves, between the clash between civil and political rights or between socio-economic rights. What is the utopia that we want to achieve? And then we have individuals as well who even criticise human rights as actually wanting to achieve, actually doing good. So we have this idea of the dark side of virtue, of human rights actually doing more harm than good. But the point I raise this is that I think it is incredibly naive to think that human rights really did reach their peak in 1950 when the European Convention of Human Rights was drafted. They certainly didn't reach their peak in 1215 when the Magna Carta was signed. They didn't reach it in the Declaration of Independence. And if a Bill of Rights is enacted, this certainly wouldn't have stopped evolving then. They're going to keep evolving in future. Okay? So if we are to take kind of any positive legacy from Magna Carta, I think it should be that this idea that rights evolve and that the progress and that the very things that politicians praise Magna Carta for are also the things that they're using to criticise the European Convention of Human Rights.
Thank you. Any points that anyone wants to raise with Alan at this point? So if we move on to, oh sorry.
Yes, I like the now teachings back in my own country concerning Magna Carta and its importance to human rights. We kind of felt like we didn't see this being played out during our years of colonial rule, and the point you raised that who the men were, I mean, definition of men brings into light that truly, I mean, there was a definition in their minds of who this rights under the Magna Carta could apply to, because it definitely didn't apply if you look at how British colonial rule, how colonial rule was operated during the colonial years. We didn't see, and to me, that would have been the greatest export. To me, that would have been the most important thing the British could have brought to all their economies. The idea of that each person is equal under the eyes of the law. that would have been the most important thing. But ultimately, I guess they they didn't feel that that was of great importance to pass to all their colonial subjects, because you could even see the differentiation how colonies were, even in law courts, the British colonies were treated differently from the local subjects. Especially in the prison system, there was segregation even within the prison system. The fact that those white prisoners were treated differently from black prisoners, and even to the point that they were transported immediately back to Britain to face whatever justice they gained. So, in a way, your piece really enlightened for me in the sense why we didn't enjoy this and we didn't experience this. But thank you very much for that.
Thank you. So our final presenter then is Ruth Houghton, who was hosted by the suffragettes. I'm a bit less Crete.
We've heard a bit about the suffragettes already today. Henry mentioned them, and Alan just mentioned them then. So yeah, I had intended to give a presentation on how they used it to kind of show that their demand for rights wasn't perhaps as radical as their critics were suggesting. But what I am going to do is change the gears slightly and take us over to literature and Shakespeare's King John. So just to get hopefully, feel for the room, not sure what that means. Has anybody seen Shakespeare's King John? No? Okay. Has anybody heard or at least kind of know about Shakespeare's Richard III? Yes, okay, big nod. And are we aware of the kind of the myths and the representation of King Richard and how that's kind of been criticised more recently? And perhaps Shakespeare could have done the same thing with the reign of King John in the sense of rewriting history. And that's the kind of idea that I want to talk about today. Henry already alluded to the fact that Magna Carta disappeared kind of post-13th century and didn't reappear until Edward Coke in the 1630s found it. In fact, perhaps that isn't true. Certainly it was used in the court of Henry VIII, the trial of Thomas More. He referred to it, and the writings of Thomas Cromwell that refer to Thomas More's trial talk about it. You have the first edition of Magna Carta printed in English, comes out in 1534. And the Chronicles, Holinshed's Chronicles, which we know Shakespeare would have referred to when writing King John, does detail in some length the kind of the debate between the barons and King John, sealing of the Magna Carta, and indeed some enforcement mechanisms that were attached to that. So Shakespeare would have had all of that information to hand. So, when you're ready. Okay, so, no, come along. Okay, so currently the Globe Theatre in London is running King John. And I went 2 weeks ago. You can imagine the scene. Cosmopolitan audience, British Library running an exhibition of Magna Carta down the road, Temple Church has its own special edition there in the Inns of Court. There are even walking maps that highlight milestones of law and liberty right across London, invoking a special relationship between London and this great charter. And yet, Magna Carta isn't mentioned in King John. The audience will be infused by the idea of Magna Carta, not least because it's written there in the corner. Might be small and, positioned out of the way, but I argue that it does act as a reminder of the legacy of Magna Carta, even if the play itself doesn't refer to either the document or the act of sealing it. So, a quick summary of the play. It kind of jumps through the marriage of Blanche and Louis in 1200, the capture of Prince Arthur, who is the nephew of King John in circa 1203, the relationship between the Pope and Pope Innocent III and King John, where the kind of excommunication was placed on King John circa 1208 to 1213, followed by the Barons' War, which was aided by the French invasion in 1215, and it even ends with the death of King John, but no mention of the Magna Carta, right, which must have happened somewhere before King John died. It should appear between the act of submitting to the Pope in Act 5, Scene 1, and the Barons' War. The difference between those two things in the play is a matter of about 22 lines, in which King John talks about how he voluntarily submits to the Pope and is saying, kind of asking for forgiveness from the Pope, but also allowing the Pope to take some role again in the running of England. So the play, I argue, toys with the idea of an anxiety around legitimate power, various ways in which King John can get consent from barons and people, and the placing of limitations on the power, and yet still the play does not mention Magna Carta. But perhaps, and what I'm trying to seek to convince you, is that the idea of the Magna Carta that we've heard about today, the limitations on power, resonate throughout the play. Indeed, in the kind of late 1800s, we see the first film of a Shakespeare play, in fact, happened to be King John. But it was Tree's representation of King John that had two tableaus, which kind of in film would be stills, where people kind of come on and they reenacted the signing of Magna Carta. So the Magna Carta was visibly placed within the play in order to respond to audiences' expectations. So you see from the early 1800s, you have Kemble, who did a production of King John, apologising that the Magna Carta wasn't in the play. And you can kind of see throughout the 1800s rewritings. So in 1800, a guy called Valpy rewrote King John to include a section where he compares the tyranny of France to the liberties of England, a direct commentary on the French Revolution. And he says, "And has not John sealed the great charter of our liberties? Blessed with our rights, we urge no further claim. The English laws are written in our hearts, and we will not change them." None of this appears in Shakespeare's original text, but that's not to suggest that Magna Carta isn't there. So there are some kind of textual references to ideas of kingship, to ideas of legitimate rule, and to kind of ideas of arbitrary rule, I guess. And what I'm trying to suggest is that using language, Shakespeare gets the audience angry, riled up, reacting to King John's use of power. It seemingly doesn't have any limits placed upon it, and the audience respond to that. So you have Constance, who is Prince Arthur's mother, petitioning the papal legate for assistance after she finds out that King Arthur has been taken by King John, and he will subsequently die. She doesn't know that bit. And she cries, "For he that holds his kingdom holds the law, therefore since the law itself is perfect wrong." Constance suggests then that the King of England holds the law, implying that the king is above the law and he can use it at his whim. This, she says, makes the law wrong. In this respect, it becomes, and it has been suggested, that it kind of invokes a tool of violence rather than a tool of justice, because the king can use this law at his whim against Prince Arthur, and indirectly then against Constance. This critique of John's power and the use of law, I would argue, invokes that spirit of Magna Carta amongst the audience, that they are aware of limitations that are placed upon government and kings, and that seeing that it isn't being placed upon, or seemingly power is being wielded by John, they then turn against King John. I mean, he's not a liked man. Throughout history, comments on King John, have been that he's a murderer and yet he is a king, by Elizabeth Inchbald. The audience are being purposefully turned against this king who is using power quite arbitrarily. It's interesting then that Alan kind of talked about the rights of widows and their kind of right, I guess, to bring a claim if their husband died, because Constance has lost her son, and yet she denies redress, which is ironic given that after the Magna Carta she wouldn't have had any redress anyway. It's just this interesting kind of Shakespeare's use, kind of highlighting where Magna Carta invokes the limitations of power, but the weakness of the Magna Carta and the idea of Magna Carta to do that, limit power. You also have the role of the bastard, which is Philip Falconbridge. His kind of actual position in history is debatable, but throughout the play he rises in power. He starts off as this guy who comes before the king claiming that his brother's stolen his land. Turns out he looks a little bit like John's brother, and they knight him. And he becomes a noble and follows John into the wars. Increasingly he becomes John's aide. But the kind of the space he operates in is both as a commoner and then as a noble, and so he's able to speak to the audience and kind of comment on John and his use of power. So towards the end of there's a battle outside the town of Aegiers, where the people of Aegiers are asked who is the king, and they say the King of England, but we don't know which one of you, Prince Arthur or King John, is indeed the King of England. Go away and sort it out yourself. And they decide, King of France and the King of England, that they're going to just storm Aegiers, and then that will make them decide. So upon that point then, the bastard is reflecting, and he notes, the relationship between the two kings can be broken upon commodity. This kind of the whimsical nature of kings, that they can make agreements and break them rather easily depending on their needs. And I'm not seeking to suggest for a minute that this is a direct comment on the way in which King John brushed aside or annulled Magna Carta, but it is again one of those moments in which the audience are turned against the use of power by the king. The bastard is provoking the audience to kind of see the limitless power of the king and to respond negatively towards that. He also then, further on in the play, so that's kind of Act 3, by Act 5, he's telling the king what to do. So he has this role of sort of reminding the king that he is a king, and to have to remind him of his kingly obligations. Now what I kind of can construct from that is this idea of people, in particular, barons constructing the nature of the king, shaping the way in which king's power is used. And perhaps that is evocative of kind of the idea of Magna Carta and the limitations placed on power. But the most important thing, I think, is the audience and how they respond to King John. So I've already noted that he's not a likeable character. In fact, the audience disapprove of his usurpation of the crown. They react to his kind of whimsical nature and use of power. There's shock and disgust at the plotted murder of Prince Arthur. So in that sense, Shakespeare is asking the audience to kind of limit the power of the king in disliking him. But in actual fact, what you see is a more complex picture. There's also, so you've got the kind of the plotted death of Arthur, who is a noble himself, royal indeed, and the pathos enacted there, because he's a very young man and everybody gets very angry that you're trying to blind him, is directly contrasted when the king says, Hubert, away with him, imprison him, and on that day at noon, whereupon he says, I show you my crown, let him hang. About Pomfret the prophet. So there's a prophet, he's depicted as a madman, comes in, says the king's going to lose his crown, and the king says, let him hang. And it's a kind of a scene that's over in a matter of minutes, and there's no kind of dramatic effect. The audience aren't provoked against King John in the same way that they are when he orders the death of Prince Arthur. I would suggest that this highlights the limitations of Magna Carta as it was seen, in particular as a kind of a nobility document. It also highlights the weaknesses of the human condition, to the extent that those that are outside of mainstream society can be denied rights at a whim. The audience aren't provoked to kind of protect the rights, or seemingly aren't concerned that this man's rights are being overrun by King John. Now yes, you might note, if you knew the play, that this all takes place before the signing of the Magna Carta, or the sealing of the Magna Carta would have happened. But the way in which Shakespeare constructs the history in the play is that events kind of run alongside each other, they kind of clash. There is seemingly no real lineal history within the play. In fact, there's a lot of acronyms, so there's a lot of mention of canons, which wouldn't have taken place in 13th century England. But it seems to be suggesting that he's trying to remind the audience to bring their kind of early modern Elizabethan ideas of government and power to the auditorium, the globe. And so he is kind of saying, well, you know, surely your ideas would have applied here, but they don't. So I think there's two ways in which we can see the Magna Carta taking place in King John. We can see it as a kind of provoking of the audience to remember the limitations of power. That throughout there are voices from Constance, there are voices from the bastard, there's also voices from the citizens of Aegeus that I haven't mentioned today, that are provoking the audience to kind of limit the power of King John. And yet at the same time Shakespeare's saying that the people aren't strong enough to do that. That there's this idea that they aren't always constant in their understanding of what it means to limit power, in the sense that they allow the prophet to be hanged. But also the space that the audience are in. You know, in the globe, if you've ever been, you're below the actors, you are outside of the action, you are outside of the political decision making. You can point and stare, you can gape, as the bastard reminds us, but you can't actually get involved and directly limit that power of King John. You might be in terrible rage that King John is this horrible king using his power, but actually you can't kind of do anything about that. And I think perhaps Shakespeare's commenting on the irrelevance then of Magna Carta as a document, and indeed then Magna Carta is kind of evident in its absence, that it is both there through the audience, but actually its irrelevance is obvious because the people can't do much about it. And I'm happy to take questions because that was a whirlwind. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so presenters, are you able to stay around for 5 or 10 minutes or so, and maybe if people have questions, you could approach them directly, and also please feel free to join us for wine and food. The tickets for the exhibition, they say it begins at 4, but apparently it's possible to go in before then, so I'll just leave them here for you. So thank you, and if you can join me again, thank you.
I know what I wanted to say. It's very difficult when you don't know. No, it hasn't been within as a globe for a very long time. And I think when I read the synopsis, it's a nothing play. You know, everything happens and nothing.
I think there's a reason why some plays are full and others are not.
Yeah. Doesn't seem to be much of a continuous plot, but actually
Thank you.